This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor. This is the Al Jazeera NewsHour, live from London. Coming up,
we absolutely believe that he was tortured in the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life.
anger and outrage from the lead lawyer of George Floyd as 3 more police officers involved in his death are charged with aiding and abetting murder. And the UK adds its voice to a growing global protest as thousands march through central London in solidarity with America's anti-racism demonstrations. China warns the UK to back off as Britain talks of offering citizenship to millions of Hong Kong residents. An about turn from Sweden's top epidemiologist who admits the country should have done more to curb coronavirus. Minnesota's Attorney General has vowed to seek justice for George Floyd after issuing arrest warrants for 3 more police officers over his death. The men have been charged with aiding and abetting murder in a case that sparked fury and protests across all of America's 50 states. Derek Chauvin, the white ex-policeman who pressed a knee to Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, has also had his charge elevated to second-degree murder.
To the Floyd family, to our beloved community, and to everyone that is watching, I say, George Floyd mattered. He was loved. His family was important. His life had value. And we will seek justice for him and for you, and we will find it. The very fact that we have filed these charges means that we believe in them.
Earlier, Floyd's son, Quincy, visited a makeshift memorial to his father. It's been set up on the Minneapolis street corner where the 46-year-old died last week. Floyd's brother and younger daughter have also travelled to the city in the aftermath of his death. It has sparked widespread unrest and protests across the United States, which have spread around the world.
We cannot have 2 justice systems in America, one for black America and one for white America. We must have equal justice for the United States of America. Yeah! And change is going to come in the tragic killing of George Floyd. And I proclaim, with his son as my witness, that change starts today.
And protests have been taking place over George Floyd's death across the United States. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett joins us live now. So the protests, obviously they'll be taking in the fact that there are these new charges. But in the meantime, in terms of the president, what options does he have when it comes to dealing with the protests?
Well, first of all, the press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, saying that the death of George Floyd is being investigated to find out whether or not his civil rights were violated. So that is being pursued at the federal level separate from the charges that are being pursued at the state level. I can also tell you, though, when it comes to the U.S. president quelling the violence, well, he has the opportunity to use what's known as the Insurrection Act if he wishes to try and quell the violence. Now, very quickly, what this means is that this would be the military moving in, and this is something that's really a last option because typically it is the governors that control policing in the various states, not the president. In fact, the president can't use the military for policing. It's an act known as the Posse Comitatus Act. Only in this exception can he do so. So that is a tool that the White House press secretary says is available to the president. The president also speaking today on a conservative talk show said, though, that he doesn't believe that there is systemic racism in the police forces of the United States, and he says that this is sort of isolated cases. He also said that when it comes to mistrust of police in communities of color, he sees this as a long-term problem. In other words, he doesn't have a short-term solution.
And Kimberly, the Defence Secretary has also been speaking about this. What's he been saying?
Yeah, Yeah, well, he has come out in kind of rare distancing from the president. We've seen the defense secretary say that the sort of last option, the Insurrection Act, that the White House press secretary says is a tool that the president will use if necessary, is one that he doesn't believe is appropriate. In fact, he was very strong in his wording that now is not the time.
I've always believed and continue to believe that the National Guard is best suited for performing domestic support to civil authorities in these situations in support of local law enforcement. I say this not only as Secretary of Defense, but also as a former soldier and a former member of the National Guard. The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Now, in terms of protests around the White House, right now it is very quiet in contrast to previous days. In fact, there are some protests that are occurring in Washington, but the federal forces have moved them far away from the White House. And the active duty military that had been deployed in D.C., we understand now it's being widely reported that many of them are returning to their bases.
Kimberly Halkett, thank you very much indeed. Well, Shihab Ratanzi is with those protesters in Washington. Shihab, what's the reaction been there to the news of the latest charges?
There is more of a celebratory air here, clearly. There is relief. Clearly, it's a long way to go. How many times, after all, have we covered cases where it seems like an open and shut case with video evidence of murder, and yet police officers have walked free? There are so many loopholes that mean that the police can walk free having killed someone on videotape. We know that from bitter experience. Everyone knows that from bitter experience. But clearly that's contributing to what has been, once again, peaceful demonstrations. Several hundred people now outside the White House. The posture of the security forces here has changed, though. As Kimberly suggested, we've now been moved away from the White House, and we have a sort of ranks of National Guard now here in front of us. Yesterday, Tuesday rather, was relatively peaceful, and I have to say one of the main reasons for that was because of that 8-foot-high chain-link fence that had been erected in front of Lafayette Square, which is then, there's a square and then you have the White House, because in many ways it meant that the security forces weren't in our face. They weren't right next to us. And what we've always found over the course of the last few days and in previous demonstrations is that it's almost as if they feel they have to act every now and then, randomly lashing out, throwing out smoke and pepper bombs and pepper spray and so on. We never know when, we never know why, and that always leads to that sense of unease. But yesterday they were behind their cage almost, on the other side of a fence, which meant that there wasn't that constant flashpoint or focus of rage, especially and sort of periodic moments of it, completely, apparently to us at least, who haven't read their field manuals, irrational behavior from the lines against peaceful protesters. Once again now we're worried, well, what are they doing here? Why are they up here? They're once again in our face. I mean, clearly the goal is to clear much more of a perimeter using overtly military armored vehicles, which have now blocked off. You can see St. John's Church, which the photo opportunity or the location of the photo opportunity which caused so much outrage and which led to the protests multiplying in size many times over on Tuesday. But we're completely now cordoned off from anywhere near the White House, and we have this National Guard presence. And Kimberly was talking about the National Guard, the Insurrection Act, what Mark Esper was saying about it. There was no need for the Insurrection Act to be invoked. We don't have that luxury in D.C. We don't have a governor. We're not a state. The mayor says she doesn't want troops on the streets of D.C. But we have no control over that. Our elected officials in D.C. have no control over that. We don't even have an elected official in Congress to make the case for us. These troops are all under federal control, and Donald Trump doesn't need to invoke the Insurrection Act to put troops under federal control on the streets of Washington, D.C., and we're feeling that now. Not only these troops, by the way, the National Guard, but also all these paramilitary units from the DEA, the DOJ, Bureau of Prisons. There are all sorts of paramilitary units wandering around here, and we've no idea, and often without any identification. It's a very strange situation here in Washington, D.C.
Shihab Ratanzi, thank you very much. John Hendren is in Minneapolis for us. So, John, where you are, the call was very clearly in the last few days for charges against those who were involved in the death of George Floyd, and now those charges have come through for the other officers as well. What have people been saying to you there about that?
Well, there's definitely a sense of relief here now that these charges have been issued. And I don't know whether it's because of the charges or because it's another beautiful day, but there are hundreds of people streaming in here now. So there are 1,000 people. Many are over here to my left listening to a speaker. Others are over my shoulder at that somber site where George Floyd spent his last moments. But this is exactly what this crowd has been calling for, and it's exactly what the family of George Floyd have been calling for. Derek Chauvin's charges have been elevated from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. Now, what does that mean? In practical terms, it's the difference between a maximum sentence of 25 years and one of 40 years. And technically speaking, third-degree murder means there was a reckless disregard for human life, but not an intent to kill. Second-degree murder means there was an intent to kill, but it was not premeditated. That's a very serious difference. And these other three officers are being charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder, also a very serious charge. In recent Minnesota history, only the prosecutor in this county has been able to prosecute one police officer for murder. And these charges have come out very quickly, but it could take months before we get some kind of final resolution. How long? Let me give you an idea. In Chicago, recently, an officer, Jason Van Dyke, was convicted of murdering Laquan McDonald, who was walking away with a knife but had his back toward the officers. That case, the shooting happened in 2014. Video came out in 2015. Van Dyke was not convicted and sentenced to murder until 2019. So it could be quite some time, and still we're wondering what's going to happen in the streets between now and then.
And John, are there other specific demands that the protesters want as a result of these events?
There are indeed, and the Attorney General referred to them. Keith Ellison said one prosecution or one series of prosecutions isn't going to be enough to solve the racial problems that have roiled an entire nation. He says there needs to be systematic change. Police departments and cities need to change the way they deal with prosecutions and racial issues. Here in Minneapolis, for instance, the minority population is only about 40%, but over 65% of the prosecutions in cases that involve allegations of excessive force. Now, the governor of Minnesota yesterday launched an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department, saying that they're going to look into systematic racial unfairness and that he's asked for them to make some immediate changes. That's the kind of thing these crowds are calling for. But ultimately what they want to do is stop having the need to meet at spots where police officers have killed unarmed African Americans. That's the real demand, and obviously that is a long-term solution.
John Hendren, thank you very much indeed. In central London, tens of thousands of people have marched in a show of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests. The rally started in Hyde Park before winding its way to Parliament Square. The protests spilled onto the street, bringing traffic to a standstill, but it remained mostly peaceful. Many activists knelt outside Westminster, chanting "No justice, no peace, no racist police." Star Wars actor John Boyega was moved to tears as he spoke to protesters.
I need you to understand how painful it is to be reminded every day that your race means nothing. And that isn't the case anymore. That is never the case anymore. We are going to try today. We are a physical representation of our support for George Floyd.
Asad Beg was at the rally in London and says protesters are also drawing attention to racism in the UK.
Several thousand people have turned up to show their support and solidarity for what's taking place in the United States. But for people here, it's not just about what's happening in the United States, it's about the racial inequalities here in the United Kingdom. Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched. There's been a number of deaths in police custody of black people, but also the death of Mark Duggan, who was shot and killed by police in 2011, led to riots. We spoke to people here earlier to see why they were here and how they feel.
It's touching, man. Like, being somebody of colour myself growing up, it's not always been something that I felt comfortable speaking to with everyone about it. So I think the nicest thing about today is just being surrounded by so many people, not being afraid to have those conversations, even in the light of what's happened in the past fortnight.
It's unbelievable. I'll never think that these many people decide. And it's good that it's white, black, Asian, everyone coming together, because that's basically what it's about.
Protesters here have been saying Black Lives Matter and been saying no justice and no peace. They've turned up at Downing Street, which is the residence of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, he earlier said that he understood the anger and grief, but not only in the United States, but across the world. And in an unprecedented move, police chiefs here have said that they are appalled at the death of George Floyd and have asked for justice in the United States. But have also acknowledged that more needs to be done in this country to tackle racism.
Still ahead on this NewsHour from London, Lebanon's money exchangers return to work, but will they be able to end the country's worst ever economic crisis? More than 1 million people are put under lockdown in Colombia's capital after a surge in coronavirus cases. China is warning the UK that interfering in Hong Kong's affairs could backfire. That's after the British Prime Minister said the UK was ready to offer millions of people in Hong Kong a route to citizenship if a controversial national security law is imposed. China says foreign influence is a threat to the territory's stability and prosperity. Those sentiments have been echoed by Hong Kong's Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, who's in Beijing to meet Chinese officials.
I can only say that the international community and some of the foreign governments have been adopting.
Let's take you straight to President Obama, who's talking about the George Floyd case.
All the great things that you're going to be doing in the future. Good afternoon, everybody. All the participants, all the panelists. Let me start by just acknowledging that we have seen in the last several weeks, last few months, the kinds of epic changes and events in our country that are as profound as anything that I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm now a lot older than planned. I'm going to be 59 soon. And let me begin by acknowledging that although all of us have been feeling pain, uncertainty, disruption, some folks have been feeling it more than others. Most of all, the pain that's been experienced by the families of George and Brianna and Ahmaud and Tony and Sean and too many others to mention, those that we thought about during that moment of silence. And to those families who've been directly affected by tragedy, please know that Michelle and I and the nation grieve with you, hold you in our prayers. We're committed to the fight of creating a more just nation in memory of your sons and daughters. And we can't forget that even as we're confronting the particular acts of violence that led to those losses, our nation and the world is still in the midst of a global pandemic that's exposed the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, but also the disparate treatment and, as a consequence, the disparate impact that exists in our healthcare system, the unequal investment, the biases that have led to a disproportionate number of infections and loss of life in communities of color. So in a lot of ways, what has happened over the last several weeks is challenges and structural problems here in the United States have been thrown into high relief. They're the outcomes not just of the immediate moments in time, but they're the result of a long history of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and institutionalized racism that too often have been the plague, this original sin of our society. And in some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized. Because historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people. Dr. King was a young man when he got involved. Cesar Chavez was a young man. Malcolm X was a young man. The leaders of the feminist movement were young people. Leaders of union movements were young people. The leaders of the environmental movement in this country and the movement to make sure that the LGBT community finally had a voice and was represented were young people. And so when sometimes I feel despair, I just see what's happening with young people all across the country and the talent and the voice and the sophistication that they're displaying. And it makes me feel optimistic. It makes me feel as if, this country is going to get better. Now, I want to speak directly to the young men and women of color in this country who, as Playon just so eloquently described, have witnessed too much violence and too much death. And too often, some of that violence has come from folks who were supposed to be serving and protecting you. I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And when I go home and I look at the faces of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, and I look at my nephews and nieces, I see limitless potential that deserves to flourish and thrive. And you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog or are driving down the street or looking at some birds in a park. And so I hope that you also feel hopeful, even as you may feel angry, because you have the power to make things better, and you have helped to make the entire country feel as if this is something that's got to change. You've communicated a sense of urgency that is as powerful and as transformative as anything that I've seen in recent years. I want to acknowledge the folks in law enforcement that share the goals of reimagining policing, because there are folks out there who took the oath to serve your communities and your countries, have a tough job, and I know you're just as outraged about the tragedies in recent weeks as are many of the protesters. And so we're grateful for the vast majority of you who protect and serve. I've been heartened to see those in law enforcement who've recognized, let me march along with these protesters. Let me stand side by side and recognize that I want to be part of the solution. And who've shown restraint and volunteered and engaged and listened, because you're a vital part of the conversation. And change is going to require everybody's participation. Now, when I was in office, as was mentioned, I created a task force on 21st century policing in the wake of the tragic killing of Michael Brown. That task force, which included law enforcement and community leaders and activists, was charged to develop a very specific set of recommendations to strengthen public trust and foster better working relationships between law enforcement and communities that they're supposed to protect, even as they're continuing to promote effective crime reduction. And that report showcased a range of solutions and strategies that were proven and that were based on data and research to improve community policing and collect better data and reporting and identify and do something about implicit bias in how police were trained and reforms to use the force that police deploy in ways that increase safety rather than precipitate tragedy. And that report demonstrated something that's critical for us today. Most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. Now, reform has to take place in more than 19,000 American municipalities, more than 18,000 local enforcement jurisdictions. And so as activists and everyday citizens raise their voices, we need to be clear about where change is going to happen and how we can bring about that change. It is mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. And that determines police practices in local communities. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide typically whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. And those are all elected positions. And in some places, they're police community review boards with the power to monitor police conduct. Those oftentimes may be elected as well. The bottom line is, I've been hearing a little bit of chatter in the internet about voting versus protest, politics and participation versus civil disobedience and direct action. This is not a either or. This is a both and. To bring about real change, we both have to highlight a problem and make people in power uncomfortable, but we also have to translate that into practical solutions and laws that can be implemented and we can monitor and make sure we're following up on. So, very quickly, let me just close with a couple of specific things. What can we do? Number one, we know there are specific evidence-based reforms that, if we put in place today, would build trust, save lives, would not show an increase in crime. Those are included in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. You can find it on obama.org. Number two, a lot of mayors and local elected officials read and supported the task force report, but then there wasn't enough follow-through. So today I am urging every mayor in this country to review your use of force policies with members of your community and commit to report on planned reforms. What are the specific steps you can take? And I should add, by the way, that the original task force report was done several years ago. Since that time, we've actually collected data, in part because we implemented some of these reform ideas. So we now have more information and more data as to what works. And there are organizations like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and others that are out there highlighting what the data shows, what works, what doesn't in terms of reducing incidents of police misconduct and violence. Let's go ahead and start implementing those. So we need mayors, county executives, others who are in positions of power to say this is a priority. This is a specific response. Number three, every city in this country should be a My Brother's Keeper community, because we have 250 cities, counties, tribal nations who are working to reduce the barriers and expand opportunity for boys and young men of color through programs and policy reforms and public-private partnerships. So go to our website, get working with that, because it can make a difference. And let me just close by saying this. I've heard some people say that you have a pandemic, then you have these protests. This reminds people of the 60s and the chaos and the discord and distrust throughout the country. I have to tell you, although I was very young when you had riots and protests and assassinations and discord back in the 60s, I know enough about that history to say there is something different here. You look at those protests, and that was a far more representative cross-section of America out on the streets, peacefully protesting, and who felt moved to do something because of the injustices that they had seen. That didn't exist back in the 1960s, that kind of broad coalition. The fact that recent surveys have showed that despite some protests having then been marred by the actions of some, a tiny minority that engaged in violence, that despite, as usual, that got a lot of attention, a lot of focus. Despite all that, a majority of Americans still think those protests were justified. That wouldn't have existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. There is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better. And that is not as a consequence of speeches by politicians. That's not the result of, spotlights in news articles. That's a direct result of the activities and organizing and mobilization and engagement of so many young people across the country who put themselves out on the line to make a difference. And so I just have to say thank you to them and, for helping to bring about this moment and just make sure that we now follow through. Because at some point, attention moves away. At some point, protests start to dwindle in size. And it's very important for us to take the momentum that has been created as a society, as a country, and say, let's use this to finally have an impact. All right? Thank you, everybody. Proud of you guys. And I know that we're going to be hearing from a bunch of people who have been on the front lines on this and know a lot more than
Former US President Barack Obama there, talking about the challenges, as he put it, of the pandemic and the death of George Floyd, which have exposed what he described as the institutionalized racism in the country, and urging people to not just highlight the problems by protesting, but also translate that into action. Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, who's joining us live. Kimberly, put this into context. I mean, in the past, former President Obama stayed out of the limelight when it came to sort of big issues, or in general, he stayed out of the limelight. In the last few weeks, though, he seems to have been ramping up his interventions.
Yeah, the U.S. president, in one of his final speeches as president, Barack Obama, stated that he would be silent, but if there were instances where he felt compelled to speak out, particularly when it came to the issues of racism and discrimination, that he could not be silent. And it's clear in the last 2 days, this is one of those times. The U.S. President Barack Obama there talking about many of the points that he made just 24 hours earlier when he posted on the blogging platform Medium a lengthy post about how to inspire young people to take this to the next step. Because, of course, these protests we've seen across the United States, the U.S. President Barack Obama there noting that while these protests are more diverse than, say, in the 1960s, it is still predominantly the young people in both the 60s and now that is driving this movement. And that has given him a lot of optimism. But he, without mentioning U.S. President Donald Trump by name, he suggested that, and much of these protests have been directed and have been anti-Trump in many ways, but well, it is appropriate, he says, to voice the frustration and to make people at the highest levels uncomfortable. The change really happens not in the White House, but at the local level, which is far down in terms of the government food chain, if you will. That many of the people that have the most impact on communities and their policing is not the president, is not the U.S. Congress, but are the mayors, are the district attorneys that would lay charges, the police chiefs. These are the people, these are elected people. And it's important to note that while there is very strong participation in U.S. elections in November for president, for Congress, where we see pitiful turnout in the voice of Barack Obama is at those local levels, especially among young people. So this is his call to action. There's room for protesting, but you also need to vote.
Kimberly Halkett, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me live now is Melvin Carter, who's the mayor of St. Paul, the state capital of Minnesota. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us. I'd like to take you back, first of all, to the charges that we've heard about today in the case of George Floyd. What's your reaction to those that have been brought through today?
Thanks for having me on. I think those charges are absolutely critical. I'm the son of a police officer. My father spent 28 years as a member of the St. Paul Police Department here. And one thing he taught me every day was that a police officer's job is you're never on break, you're never on pause. Your job is to always help when someone is being hurt. You know, our national security advisor to the White House said recently that he thinks our challenges with policing in America are limited to a couple bad apples. Well, clearly, this killing, the murder of George Floyd never should have happened. He should still be alive. But when you look at this video that has not just one officer, but the three others in it, two who are helping to hold him down and one who's guarding the scene, that undeniably points to a culture of aggression, a culture of violence, a culture of escalation that cannot be a part of our future.
And how do you think that can be changed, that institutional culture?
Well, it starts exactly there. It starts with making sure that those officers know and that our community members know that when a life is taken, especially when it's so wrongful, when it's so blatant, so egregious, and so well documented as what we see in the video of George Floyd's killing, that someone will be held accountable for it. One of the central ingredients of the anger and frustration and rage that we're seeing play out all over our country is the fact that, one, George Floyd should still be alive. He never should have been killed, especially in just gruesome fashion like that at the hands of law enforcement. Two, that he's not the first name on the list. We have seen in America, one after the next, unarmed, unaggressive African-American men killed at the hands of law enforcement, and too often we see charges dropped or we see acquittals and no one is held accountable. We have to assert that George Floyd's life is valuable, that my life is valuable, such that when our lives are taken, someone is held accountable. That's the first step. My challenge to my constituents here is peace, but never patience. We have to be peaceful. We have to channel our energy, channel this frustration and anger into ways that can help us build for a better future. But I am not asking people to sit idly by while we slowly and incrementally stem the tide of black and brown men and women killed by law enforcement.
You mentioned that there have been a long list of people who've been killed in this way and that there hasn't been accountability. Do you think this time the protests and the way this is being handled are potentially a turning point for America?
Look, I hope this is a turning point for America. And I want to say very clearly, the way that we've seen this anger manifested, the way that we've seen this anger expressed too often through rioting, looting, violence, arson, is of course unacceptable. It's destructive and it's re-victimizing and re-traumatizing the exact same communities who have it hardest in the first place. That's unacceptable and it's unhelpful. But let me be clear, the energy we've seen, that energy we've seen is the same energy that built America. It's the energy that ended slavery. It's the energy that's seen us through every rough patch. My hope is that we continue to engage with this level of energy, that we address and channel this energy not towards destroying our own neighborhoods, but destroying all of the factors that continue to perpetuate systemic inequities and make it so hard to prosecute members of law enforcement when our lives are unjustly taken.
Former President Obama just now was talking about the real need for the local accountability, that the mayors and the county executives who appoint the police chiefs and so on, they're the ones who have to play a part. So you're a mayor. What's your kind of the first thing you need to do? Do you personally, are there any particular measures that you think you ought to take that will make this situation less possible in the future?
Look, this is why I ran for office in the first place. I already told you that I'm the son of a police officer. I'm also one of probably relatively few American elected officials who know what it feels like to be pulled over for driving while black. My father taught me too growing up that the most valuable public safety asset that we can have is the trust, that critical trust that has to flow between our officers and our community members. That trust is necessary towards keeping all of us safe, both the neighbors and our officers. It absolutely must be there. I am thankful that those issues play out at the local level, particularly right now when we just saw the President of the United States threaten an armed force against the American people. I think that that's wrong-headed and clearly misunderstands what the problem is. You know, I would say that if the president thinks that there's any force, foreign or domestic, that can, quote, dominate the American people out of standing up and fighting for justice when clearly injustice is playing out, then he misunderstands the strength and character of the American people, and he misunderstands the historic truth that when you try to silence the voices of dissent through violence and force, those voices only grow louder.
On the issue, though, back to the local issue, we heard President Obama talking about it's important to protest, to make your voice heard, but you also then need to vote. And those local elections, as Kimberly Halkett was pointing out, do have pitifully low turnouts, was what Obama said, pitifully low turnouts in these races. How do you galvanise young people in particular to actually vote in the elections that somehow they don't view as important, I mean, and that actually ultimately will make a difference to the policies on the ground?
That's an absolutely critical question. And I thank you for bringing me back to the local issues, because I'll tell you that the things that I think need to be done, because this was so central in why I ran for office in the first place, the things that I think need to be done to help prevent this from happening in the future, we are already doing in St. Paul. We completely rewrote our use of force policies in St. Paul in the first 2 months of my administration. We're the only law enforcement agency on the planet that I'm aware of that has engaged community members in a 2-month, two-way conversation about what our use of force policies should be. You know, we have worked with our police department to engage and really expand our community-based policing models, and we've adopted a philosophy on public safety that isn't just about what happens after something bad happens, after someone calls the police, but that really centers around how do we reduce the number of times people in our community have to call the police in the first place. I think the fact that so many people stay home, not just for local elections, but for the presidential election as well, is because there are so many Americans who feel disaffected. They feel like that the things that we talk about, we've lost their trust. They feel like the things that we talk about don't impact them, won't change their life, and maybe it'll impact the stock market or those folks who own stocks and assets and have their favorite team in Washington, D.C., but they don't address the issues on the street. Our focus in St. Paul is engaging people in those issues, is making sure that they understand that we are talking about issues that impact their lives. When we talk to young people about raising the minimum wage, when we talk to young people about improving our relationships with police officers, when we talk to young people about just raising the economic strength and character and fortitude of our community so that people can make money work for them and not against them, they plug in, they get involved, and actually they start running the conversation.
Melvin Carter, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Al Jazeera. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, Libya's UN-recognised government says forces loyal to the warlord Khalifa Haftar are losing more ground. It says he's being pushed back further towards his stronghold of Tahuna. Earlier in the day, government troops carried out at least 10 airstrikes trying to recapture the disused Tripoli airport. Haftar's forces retreated. His fighters launched an offensive to seize the capital just over a year ago. Mahmoud Abdelwahed is in Tripoli with the latest.
We're now standing on the bridge linking the city centre of the capital, Tripoli, with the old inactive international airport. Now the government forces have launched a new offensive to recapture the old inactive international airport and its vicinity. Now Haftar's forces are positioned beyond that tower. As you can see here now, that tower is in the middle of the old inactive international airport. Haftar's forces withdraw from this area, but the government forces say that Haftar's forces planted landmines, which is derailing their progress to recapture the airport and its vicinity. Meanwhile, the government forces launched a new offensive also in the vicinity of the city of Tarhuna, the last stronghold of Haftar's forces. Now, this way links the capital city center with the old inactive international airport. Now, the government forces' progress is attributed mainly to the advancement of the government air force, and Haftar's forces' air strikes have been recently decreasing notably. That's because the government forces have set up jamming systems in the vicinity of the old inactive international airport. The government forces here say that if they recaptured the airport and its vicinity, then they can easily move on the city of Tarhuna, the last stronghold of Haftar's forces in the west of Libya.
The UN says some of its programs in Yemen will need to close by the end of the month unless they get an immediate injection of cash. That's after donors fell $1 billion short of the target at a virtual pledging conference on Tuesday. A Saudi UAE-led coalition has been fighting Houthi rebels in Yemen for more than 5 years. There are now concerns that the country's depleted health system means coronavirus could be spreading easily. Officials in India have urged people to stay at home because of a tropical cyclone that's hit 2 states on the west coast. At least 100,000 residents of Maharashtra and Gujarat states have already left their homes. In Mumbai, dozens of patients recovering from the coronavirus had to be moved. It's the first time in more than 70 years a cyclone has hit the area. An Iranian scientist who was released from a US prison has arrived home. Cyrus Asghari was welcomed by his family in Tehran. He was acquitted of charges of stealing state secrets in November, but he was kept in immigration custody because of an expired visa. Money exchangers in Lebanon are back at work after a month on strike. The government had blamed them for the devaluation of the currency, but there now appears to be a deal to control the market. Despite that, dollars remain in short supply, and a range of different exchange rates are moving separately. Sena Hodder reports from Beirut.
Money exchangers are back in business after a month-long strike. They were protesting against the crackdown by Lebanon's government after it blamed them for the rapid devaluation of the local currency, the lira. It has lost more than 60% of its value since October. They've now agreed to an exchange rate cap, hoping it will drop to 3,200 lira to the dollar in 2 weeks. It's not the first attempt to control the money markets.
But even with the rate of 3,000 or 3,500, the central bank will face another problem because it will exhaust its foreign reserves. The market might be controlled for a couple of days, but in the long run, we will have more than one exchange rate in the market.
Lebanon is facing its worst economic crisis in decades. Foreign currency has stopped flowing in, and its reserves are dwindling. Banks, which have imposed their own capital controls, no longer give out dollars, making everyday transactions difficult for people in an import-dependent economy.
Because of this inflation and the rate that has changed from $1,500 to $4,000, our life has dramatically changed, to be honest. We cannot maintain anymore the same lifestyle that we have, unfortunately.
The official exchange rate of 1,500 lira to the dollar remains in place to import basic goods like wheat and fuel. Other rates are being used.
For example, dollar depositors can sell up to $4,000 a month at the rate of $3,000, while the rate of $3,200 was set by the central bank for money transfer companies. This is affecting the government's talks with the International Monetary Fund. That's demanding to move to a flexible exchange rate before discussing any financial assistance.
The government argues floating the currency without foreign creditor support will have a disastrous social impact. Many Lebanese are already struggling, and many businesses have shut down.
We have been badly affected. We lost 80% of our business due to the dollar crisis. We are buying our products in dollars with an exchange rate of 4,000 to the dollar. If we run out of dollars, we will be forced to go home.
Caps on exchange rates may do little if dollars remain in short supply and as long as there is little faith in the political and economic system. Zana Khouder, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
A Rwandan genocide suspect is set to be transferred to a UN tribunal after a French court approved a request. Félicien Kabuga is accused of bankrolling the 1994 massacre of at least 800,000 people. His defense team had argued he was too elderly and frail to be transferred. But the court ruled the 84-year-old's age and health condition were not obstacles. He was arrested in a Paris suburb last month after a quarter of a century on the run. Lesotho's former First Lady has been arrested over the murder of her husband's previous wife. Marcia Tabane was charged with ordering the killing of Lipolelo Tabane earlier this year. Her husband, Thomas Tabane, resigned last month as Prime Minister after also being suspected of involvement. The former Prime Minister has not been charged. Sweden has one of the world's highest death rates from coronavirus, and the scientist behind the country's controversial strategy now admits authorities should have done more. Sweden's government has been criticised for not imposing a lockdown. Social distancing is encouraged, but schools, bars and restaurants are open. Only gatherings of more than 50 people have been banned. But the nation of over 10 million people has recorded 4,542 deaths linked to COVID-19, far more than its Nordic neighbours, and the 8th highest death rate per capita in the world. Now, Sweden's chief epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, says the strategy wasn't enough to protect elderly people and stop the spread of infection. He says if authorities had known what they know about the disease today, the country would have aligned itself more with the rest of the world. Paul Rees is in the Swedish city of Malmö. He explains why there's been surprise over the government's admission.
Anders Tegnell's apparent criticism of the Swedish coronavirus strategy came as quite a surprise, not least because the criticism was against himself. As the state epidemiologist, it's Tegnell that the Swedish government defers to in its handling of the pandemic, and it's Tegnell and his team at the Public Health Agency who've made the recommendations rather than restrictions that have enabled Sweden to avoid a lockdown. Now, what Tegnell said on Tuesday to Swedish radio was that, with the benefit of hindsight, he might have done things differently at the start of the crisis and maybe taken a route that was somewhere between a lockdown and the more relaxed Swedish strategy. On Wednesday, Tegnell quickly moved to say, no, that's not the case. I still believe in the approach. One of the things he mentioned and that Sweden has recognised is that they've failed to protect people in old people's homes. Of the some 4,500 people who've died in Sweden, around 4,000 have been over 70 and around half lived in old people's accommodation. Now, that's one of the things that's made the death toll so much higher here than in Sweden's neighbours of Norway, Denmark and Finland. What Tegnell's also been at pains to point out on Wednesday is that we'll all have to use the benefit of hindsight in the months to come to see whether the lockdown strategy or a more relaxed Swedish strategy was more effective when we see what happens in the countries coming out of lockdown.
Well, lockdown measures are being lifted across Colombia, apart from in the capital and 2 other hard-hit cities. The mayor of Bogota has reimposed a total lockdown in one district after a spike in cases, but many local people are unhappy. Alessandro Rampietti reports.
In much of Colombia's capital, life appears close to normal, with many people returning to work. But here in the sprawling working-class section of Bogota called Kennedy, things are the opposite. Home to 1.5 million people and with 30% of all cases of coronavirus in the city, Kennedy is once again under lockdown. Authorities have ordered that for the next 2 weeks, no one will be allowed out except to seek food or medicine. But after more than 2 months in quarantine, many say they are unwilling to comply.
There are countries that have had more deaths than we have, but they've restarted their economies. So why not here? The mayor is acting like a dictator.
Yet with infections on the rise, authorities are taking no chances. Police and soldiers have been deployed at the entrance of the area, diverting traffic and demanding a new online registration for vehicles that need to enter for essential services. Recently reopened construction sites that briefly offered a respite to many day laborers have been closed again. And only a portion of Corabastos, the main produce market of the city, is operating. Entrance is allowed, but only under strict hygiene measures. Health workers have increased testing inside the installations. Although the surrounding area is teeming with informal vendors.
They want us to stay home, but if we don't go out to work, who buys the food?
The first cases of the coronavirus were detected in the rich upper-class neighborhoods in the northeast of the city. But the virus has since spread widely and at times killed mostly in poorer working-class neighborhoods where people have had a harder time respecting the restrictions and staying at home.
This is an emergency measure, but the problem is that people can't endure another quarantine. They don't have food. So even if the measures are justified, it's difficult to pretend that people can remain locked down.
With the peak of infections still weeks away, it's an almost impossible balancing act in a country that has so far managed to control the rate of the disease, but with a large population with few options but to take their chances on the streets to survive. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
The coronavirus is disproportionately killing African Americans in the US at a time when racial tensions are running high. Testing is scarce in poor, largely minority neighborhoods across the country. But one doctor in New Jersey is addressing the issue with a mobile solution. Gabriel Elizondo reports.
Trying to stop the spread of coronavirus, not from a hospital, but from the back of a van. It's the idea of Dr. Alexander Salerno, who is offering mobile testing for COVID-19 infections as well as antibodies.
Do you take any medication?
Salerno, who's run a family health clinic for 30 years, was dismayed by the inaction of authorities and the near non-existent testing in poor communities hit hardest by the virus. He took matters into his own hands and spent more than $40,000 to set up a pop-up clinic. His team tests more than 100 people a day in economically depressed neighborhoods of New Jersey.
What initially gave me the idea was really ice cream trucks and food vending trucks. Because, in urban areas, ice cream trucks, food vending trucks are very much part of summertime. And so we came up with the idea of let's do a mobile COVID testing van. Obviously the other is that not everyone can get to a doctor's office, and they really shouldn't be going to emergency rooms and hospitals for testing because that really, created a major backlog. So it's kind of like bring the testing to the people.
This is a high-rise apartment of senior housing. Everybody that lives here is elderly and particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. Many don't have the ability to go very far to get tested, and now they don't have to. They just walk out their front door to Dr. Salerno's van, get their tests done, and the results come back within 48 hours. And he turns nobody away, even if they can't afford to pay. Bernice Holmes was trying to get tested way back in March, but the nearest site was an hour away in a wealthy community, and he could never get an appointment.
Oh man, I've been waiting 2.5 months. Their first site was in Bergen County, and we from Essex County, and we couldn't go over there to get tested. I had to wait till they came over here closer because I'm here in East Orange.
Proving all it takes to get tests for people who need it the most is a place to park. Gabriel Zondo, Al Jazeera, East Orange, New Jersey.
Quick reminder, you can catch up anytime with our website. The address for that is aljazeera.com. That's it from me, Lauren Taylor, for this NewsHour. I'll be back in a minute with another full roundup. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.